this is where I might be a bit critical of the Spirit. I feel that a great deal, from my point of view now, as much as I am engaged in the spiritual life and want to teach it and read about it all the time, I feel that oftentimes it is an escape. And I think that it would do people who practice their spiritual life, it would be very good for them to do a sort of psychoanalysis of their spiritual practice, to try to explore psychologically what they are doing, and to see if there are elements deep within them that are not the best, that are weakening their practice.
Well, I think to dive in directly into your work, you've mentioned that your focus on soul, your work on soul has been the reason for you to go your own way outside of university. And I found the way you speak about soul and the way you define it in a very metaphorical, sort of symbolic, gentle way to be fascinating. And I just want to read an extended passage from your book, Care of the Soul, where you speak about soul and spirit. And I think many audience members of my channel are very interested in spirituality and growing spiritually. And here your comment is, I continue to accent the difference between soul and spirit. Spirit directs your attention to the cosmos and the planet, to huge ideas and vast adventures, to prayer and meditation and other spiritual practices, to a worldview and philosophy of life. Spirit expands your heart and mind, gives you vision and courage, and eventually leaves you with a strong sense of meaning and purpose. Soul is more intimate, deep and concrete. You care for your soul by keeping up your house, learning how to cook, playing sports or games, being around children, getting to know and love the region where you live. Soul allows you to become attached to the world, which is kind of love. Spirit inspires, while soul delves deep into the complexities of an issue. Spirit likes to have a planning meeting, soul likes to have a long and deep conversation. Spirit prefers detachment, while the soul sinks into its attachments to places, people, and home. The two dimensions are both important and valuable. You don't need to balance them because balance is too perfect, a spirit idea in the first place. It's enough to give to each what it wants and needs in the moment. So, as somebody very much identified, I think is the right word, with spiritual seeking and spiritual development, I see how often this has come at the cost of my soul development, soul experience. So could you talk a little bit about how these two dimensions of life work together, and also the conflicts that may arise when we are neglecting one or the other?
There's one thing that I think about often. I don't hear much about it. Is the shadow of spirit, or the tendency of spirit to get us into trouble or not to help us. There are some dangers in the spiritual life. And I think we have such a glorious view of the spirit, especially people who are engaged in it in their lives, that they don't notice maybe the dangers. For example, one danger, I think, is for some people anyway, is focusing so much on ideals and on their own development, like learning to meditate, and maybe to approach to try to find a kind of mysticism that is, in a way, very so high that it creates a distance from ordinary life. And I've known people, of course, in the monastery when I lived there, I knew people who were hurting their bodies by not eating. They thought that not eating was a spiritual practice for them. If they would eat as little as they could, they thought that was good. It made them more spiritual. And I thought that was very, very bad idea. because they were getting sick doing this. They were hurting their bodies. But they felt that, see, there's a masochism sometimes in spiritual life where people take pleasure in suffering, and doing without. I lived under a vow of poverty, which didn't mean not having necessities. It meant toning down possessions, but also sharing everything you own with the community you're in. And that was okay. I enjoyed that to some extent. But some people went too far with that. And they tried to live without things, without things in their life. And they lost pleasure. They thought it was good not to have pleasure in life. And these are all, I think, dangers in the spirit. And it makes sense to me because spirit, in the biggest sense of the term, rises above. It wants to go up the ladder. You hear a lot about ascension. You don't hear much about going down. But in the realm of soul, it's all about going down, deepening, going deeper. And so I think that these two ways are really helpful to each other. So imagine someone who wants to meditate, but that means that they want to meditate as part of their life. And another part of life, they may want to really enjoy what life has to offer in its in physical ways, in food and in possessions. Imagine someone who could become so high in the spirit that without abandoning their ordinary life, that could be very rich. An example of that to me is my namesake, Thomas More of England. Yeah, I've been studying his life all my life because of our names. And he was a lawyer, and he had a big house on the river, on the Thames River. And he loved good food. He did practice very strong ascetic things. I mean, he wore a hair shirt, people said, for penance. He could be very extreme in the spirit, but at the same time, he lived a very worldly life. And he was a Chancellor of England, and he was very involved as a lawyer in ordinary life. And he had a tremendous sense of humor and loved pleasure. He was an Epicurean in some ways. And so I've taken him as a model for this bridging of soul and spirit. You can do both. There's no reason why not. You don't have to understand how they all fit together. You have to live with such a broad approach to life that you can include the strong practices of the spirit and a full engagement in life.
And do you think that if we take soul and spirit separately, and if we take the ultimate direction, or let's say destination to which each one is pointing, do you think that, for example, to satisfy the needs of spirit completely, we cannot also satisfy the needs of the soul? So if I give a simple example, I want to be present as a father and as a husband, and I want to take care of our home, but I cannot do this and also become completely detached and free and non-identified with a sense of personal identity and completely liberated. So is there a conflict, or is there a way to go beyond this conflict?
Yes, there is. I think what it is something that Hillman came up with early in his career. The language is a little difficult for some people, but he called it psychological polytheism. That was one of the first articles he sent me before we met and we were exchanging letters. And it changed my life, really. It changed my life, because what that means, polytheism doesn't mean religion there. It means that psychologically, or as a person, you can see yourself as having multiple elements in you. Not parts, not like you're a puzzle with all these parts, but there are different movements and desires and possibilities in your life that are not easily reconciled. Polytheism means that they are really different. And the example that he would, of course, use would be Greek polytheism, where you have these gods and goddesses who represent the different powers in life, and they are separate. You can't get them together. They have, even in the mythology, these gods and goddesses have trouble really being together because they represent such different things. So I think that's the clue. You don't try to figure it out. What you do is you go as far as you can and want to in your spiritual life, and you make room in yourself and in your life to go as far as you can in those things of the world. And you don't worry about, you could go as far as you want in that spiritual practice and still go very, very full into life. Why see a contradiction there? I don't think that's necessary. It's in your frame of mind. I think if you are thinking opposites and thinking that, oh, you can't do both, that's your problem. You can do both. You have to come to a point where you can accept that. I find in my teaching that students have a great trouble with this idea of the psychological polytheism, because they're so ingrained with unity and having things make one sense instead of being able to live with things not actually working out together too well. But you live it anyway. You find it in yourself how you can do both things.
This reminds me of, my latest video is on the 10 Oxfording pictures of Zen Buddhism, the 10 stages of cultivation and awakening. And it's interesting in these stages how a big part of the sequential path involves letting go, detachment, and increasingly transcendent states of experience. But then the culmination of the path, the end of the path, leads back to normal, ordinary, very grounded, and now I have this new word that I can use, very soulful life. And in that sense, I know it doesn't always make sense to speak about better and worse, but in this sense, perhaps cultivating this soulful life, returning to the soul, returning to the ordinary everyday experience, is a supreme spiritual achievement in some way. Do you have any comments on this?
Oh, yes. I have been interested. I have a book called A Religion of One's Own, where I explore this. And I say that I have my own desires to be a mystic. I love the mystics, and I understand that. And I can be mystical at the piano. I can reach heights of mysticism for me. Not that I play that well, but I can play. So I'm at the piano and my fingers are engaged and my body is engaged, my emotions and my fingers, and certainly my mind. And I'm fully engaged in that. And if I play certain music, I think that it is by nature mystical music. To me, that's as much a spiritual practice as sitting alone and trying to achieve stillness or something like that. The piano itself takes me to a place. The music takes me to a place that is transcendent. And so, but it's physical and it's emotional and it's tactile, and it's ears are involved. And so it's a particular kind of mystical practice. And I'm reading the book I'm working on right now. It's finished. I'm just touching it up. Is based. I don't know if you know this man, Henry David Thoreau. He's very, very well known in the United States, and in fact, he lived just an hour's drive from where I live right now. So I feel close to him, and I feel close to the group of people called transcendentalists who are with him. And his idea is he called himself a mystic. He called himself a yogi because he traveled rivers on his homemade boat or on a canoe. And he walked through the woods and felt he felt that nature gave him the meaning of his life, the purpose in his life, and that was his inspiration. So it was very much at hand, and so I like to think of him as a natural mystic. Nature and being in nature, being in the world, is a way to become enlightened, you might say.
So, do I understand correctly that you're speaking about a kind of spirituality which does not seek transcendent experience and, I suppose, ultimate truth outside of actual concrete experience, but within it in some sense?
Yes, I think that this is where I might be a bit critical of the Spirit. I feel that a great deal, from my point of view now, as much as I am engaged in the spiritual life and want to teach it and read about it all the time, I feel that oftentimes it is an escape. And I think that it would do people who practice their spiritual life, it would be very good for them to do a sort of psychoanalysis of their spiritual practice, to try to explore psychologically what they are doing, and to see if there are elements deep within them that are not the best, that are weakening their practice because of the lack of attention to the soul.
This is actually one of the most common challenges that gets brought up in our community. People keep bringing up this conflict they have in their experience between sustaining meditation practice where one observes whatever is going through the psyche without getting attached to it, but also at the same time, what do you do with all these emotions once you observe them, once you become mindful of them? Do you just dissociate? Is this the solution? It appears that this is not the solution. But then once you start to engage with them, do you then lose the mindfulness? Do you lose all that spiritual cultivation?
No.
Yeah, what's your take on this?
That's the whole point. You don't have to lose any of it. That's what I keep saying. You can do both. See, from my point of view, there's a place for attachment and a place for detachment. There's a place for both. And not to try to figure them out, to intellectually try to understand how they can both work together, but to find it in yourself, a big enough space within yourself to be able to do both and to find value in both and to live not a separate or fragmented life at all, but to realize that we are not this solid mass. That's not who we are. We're not one thing. So we don't have to see. I hear you making these contradictions between things, and I don't see the need for them. I don't feel them. I feel that I'd rather feel comfortable with both detachment and attachment. I like both. I think they both help a great deal. You don't have to sacrifice anything in your Buddhist practice in order to live a soulful life.
Yeah, I've heard somewhere that one of your key inspirations is the Tao Te Ching. I hope I'm pronouncing it kind of correctly. Yes, and there again and again, there's the the universal insight of, you have these seeming opposites of experience, the yin and the yang and so on. And then how much of practice is essentially non-action and allowing these things to work to kind of work themselves out, and not even work themselves out, but kind of achieve their own harmony, which arises once you don't try to intervene in some way. And this is something you mention also in Care of the Soul, where you speak about how a physician is there to make space for nature, in this sense, the nature of the psyche, the unconscious, and so on, to work its own magic, let's say, and to find its own way. So this is something that is very interesting to me in your work. Actually, I was thinking in the foreword to the, I think, 25th anniversary edition of Care of the Soul, you mention 5, I think, principles which you return to again and again when you're working with clients and students and so on. Would you like to go through some of them so that you expand on them, and then we can perhaps go into what it means to care for the soul?
Yes, can you tell me what they are? Because
Yes.
I've read them a long time.
I have them here, yes.
Okay, good.
So the first principle you mention is, and I quote, serve the soul rather than the surface needs of life. If your soul is suffering neglect, you will have symptoms. You may feel depressed and your relationships may be hurting. Know the difference between caring for your soul and managing your life. What do you mean by this first principle?
Well, I think that a lot of psychology and counseling and therapy is focused on helping people solve their life problems and get along with whatever they mean by happiness. And what I do is I'm more Jungian in this way. I guess follow Jung. That I'm interested in more on what is going on deep inside a person. That's why I focus so much on their dreams, because their dreams show a picture of their life that is out of their control and out of their vision, really. It's hidden. It's more of a hidden life. And so there's a revelation when you discuss a dream with a person. And that is looking at I don't like to call it an interior life because we live this, but it's not the same as the outer life that we usually think of, the managing life. That's not it. It's more like saying, okay, what is motivating you? Like, what kind of desires do you have? What fears do you have? What holds you back from living more fully? What influences have you had that make you afraid of living your own life? Those kind of questions. Like what influences is like talking about life, but it's not trying to manage life. It's not trying to say, okay, if you do this, you'll be healthier. I'm not looking for the healthy life. I find that many people I know are full of soul, but they're not very healthy. And you wouldn't call them healthy, even emotionally healthy. But so when I do my work, I'm not trying to make people look healthy emotionally or of having a successful life. I'm trying to see who they are and seeing if whatever they're doing maybe is on that path of their soul.
Okay, so this last thing you mentioned was very interesting to me. So in your work and practice, from what I heard, you see this one's understanding of one's soul as of greater priority than, let's say, emotional stability and success in life and so on. So
Yes.
Could you just expand a bit more about that? Why is it so important, so much more important to become familiar with one's soul?
Well, for one thing, your soul is the root of your life. I think it's the source of your life. And I think that one way to look at it with giving I don't want to take all attention away from your living. That's important too, obviously. But your living could be an expression of soul rather than fighting against it. And I think that's, if you want your life to be calmer and have some of these problems go away, rather than focus on mechanically trying to adjust your life to make those problems go away, what I do, I follow Hillman's advice there. I go into the problems. We call it going with the symptom. We go into the symptom. We go into it to find out what's going on without judgment, without making judgments about it, to try to see how that symptom might show us what's going on in the soul life. Because if you are in touch with that soul life, you are more intimate with yourself of who you are and what you can be. It's like, I think it's like being connected. It's not disconnected from life, but you are then in touch with this, what is the spring of your life. I mean that like a spring where water gushes out. It's like your life pours out of this spring, and if you focus just on your life, that's so external and so mechanical. It's not really talking about your nature of who you are. And when you get deep enough into the soul, and this teaching has been going on for thousands of years, the deeper you get into your soul, the more you expand beyond yourself. This is a kind of beyond self approach, that you get closer to a larger life that is going on, that is somehow more engaged. It's at that very deep level with other people around you. And so your connections with other people at the soul level are so important, because they connect so deeply, and not just on the surface of your life arrangements, but very deeply. I think married people understand this to some extent, that when you get married, you may think that you've made a choice to live with somebody and everything's going to be fine because that's going to be a happier way of life. But then you discover that you encounter things that you didn't expect to find in this other person. And they have their own fate, their own destiny, and their own will, and their own urges, and their own fears. These are all very deep. And some of them relate to family issues. You can tell they're rooted in their family. I think when you get married, and in a way you get married into your partner's family, you begin to realize that you married the family as well as the person, that this expands. This soul of this person expands, and it gets into other areas. And it's not just family, it goes even further than family, maybe to culture, and then maybe to things that are very mysterious. So that's what I'm interested in, those deeper soul levels, rather than staying on the surface of managing life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and also what you've just mentioned is about going into the symptoms instead of going against them is one of the things that I found most striking in care of the soul. So this is also actually your second principle, where you write your symptoms are the raw material for your soul making. If you're having emotional problems, don't automatically just try to get rid of them. Look at them closely to see what your soul needs. I found this to be very true in my life, but reading your work, I see how much further this goes than what I've had experience with. So I wanted you to comment on that. Also with the added, let's say, to be, let's say, the devil's advocate here, I should say that there is also a shadow side of going into the symptoms, I think, because, of course, one may get identified with the symptom. I know this is not what you mean, so I just wanted to hear what you mean by it and how we can use our symptoms for guidance.
Yes, I understand there could be ways of doing that would not be helpful. But what I mean by it, and I learned this mainly from Hilma, but largely from his wife at the time I knew him, Patricia Berry, she really made she really emphasized this idea of going with the symptom. And what it means to me is best to give you an example, if I could, before trying to be more general about it. For example, if someone tells me they're lonely, and that's their main problem, they just feel lonely, and they're really overwhelmed by the loneliness. And if I think the temptation would be to say, well, let's see if there are ways you can be with people. How could you be more with people, or maybe be with animals, or find some way to not be lonely by going to in the opposite direction and trying to find some companionship and community and so on. But if you go with the symptom, you explore your loneliness and you try to see what it wants, itself what it wants. So perhaps a person's loneliness might be asking them to be more of an individual, to really not to be identified with other people. And so as a therapist, I might ask that question. With this idea in the back of my mind to go with the symptom, I might ask, well, do you feel that you're heavily influenced by people? Do people influence you too much? And a person might very well say, well, as a matter of fact, yes, I feel that I follow people rather than follow my own way. And I say, well, I wonder if your loneliness then is asking you to be more lonely or more alone. Let's explore this thing in a big way so we don't just stick with the symptom of loneliness, but see where that leads us. And it might lead to being more of an individual, not identify with others and not so connected with others. And so that would be going into the symptom to see if that symptom is asking us to do something. It's giving us a hint as to where we should go.
Mm-hmm. And for example, one of the members of the audience submitted a question for you. She's interested in, she's finding it hard to understand what is the meaning of self-love and how one can love oneself. And she's finding it hard to do it and to even understand what it means. So in her case, for example, what would it mean to go into the symptom? And would that be the right way to proceed?
So what is the symptom then? It's not self-love because that's what she's looking for.
Yeah.
So it's not being able to love herself, right? That's the symptom. So rather than try to encourage her in so many different ways to say, there's so many reasons why you should love yourself, that would be not going with the symptom. The alternative way with that might be to say, well, I wonder if there are other, maybe you could approach this as, I'd have to ask, I guess, I'd have to explore with her what she is doing instead of loving herself. How does she experience that symptom to see what that is? But I could make a guess. Now, talking to you, I could guess that perhaps she might be someone who has to learn to love the world more, like the non-self. And that's what she's complaining about. She can't arrive at self-love. So maybe she's stuck in not loving herself. So I would, if I hear that, I might say, well, I wonder if, do you love where you live? Do you love this? Or do you find that you want to get out of where you live? Do you want to leave? Do you feel any desire to move on to someplace else? Or do you just feel dissatisfied? Or I might say, could you, do you love your house, your home? Or do you love your friends? How are your friendships? Friendship is a form of love. And it's not self, really. It's not self-love. How are you doing with that? And you see, I'd be exploring the kind of love that's not self-love in order to, instead of focusing on the symptom itself, and trying to overcome the symptom. I try not to do that. But I try to explore it. This is a very important part of therapy. And this applies to Hillman's interesting book called Healing Fictions, where he talks about how our narrative is what's really important. So what I do here, what I'm doing in talking to you this way is to say that my approach is not to solve the problem or to help the person solve the problem, like intellectually to say what's going on here, or to explain it, but to find narrative stories. And what I might do if I don't know exactly. I don't have a hint because I'm not talking to this person now. I don't have the hints. I might just think about things that might be not self-love that I want to explore with her, but I do it by asking for stories, really. What are her stories of her life, the stories of her friendships, the stories of her home, and so on. So I would bring those stories to play, and those would give me deeper clues as to what's going on with the symptom. But I would avoid trying to correct the symptom.
Mm-hmm. Here I want to delve just a bit deeper and return to, again, this interplay between soul and spirit. Because, for example, in Buddhism as well, but also in the teachings of Jiddu Krishnamurti, for example, whom I've done work on the channel, there's this idea that the mind's fabrication of stories is what keeps us at a distance from our true nature, our empty nature. So in this sense, again, I understand that you don't like the idea of there being conflict between them, but in this sense, how do these two approaches reconcile? The idea of just letting go of all stories and emptying the mind, and the idea of choosing the right stories that I suppose that they're most healthy for your soul.
Well, I understand that. Here, what I would do is explore this idea of truth. If this when things are true, the true self, and so on. It's a word that we don't use psychologically. I mean, in my work, I don't use it really at all. I think it's a dangerous word in some ways. So I would say that if that is pushed too far, it's getting to the point where the spiritual life is too removed from the soul to be safe. So whenever people talk about this is my true self, or this is my true calling, or this is my true doctrine, I think you have to be very careful there. You're on dangerous ground, because you're not, by putting it that way, you're not allowing other possibilities. It's very hard then to go and open yourself up to a bigger world, because you are narrowing your life, maybe to this one teacher, and maybe to this one doctrine, and to this one kind of language. So I would from my point of view, I would say that's verging on the realms of spirit that are dangerous, and I think we need to pull back from those. And so I would be critical of that approach, that kind of teaching. I don't think it leaves an open window to the soul.
Mm-hmm. Actually, your approach of taking things figuratively and reading, using the mind's ability to conjure up stories, but also to be receptive to stories, to recognize stories, was one of the most refreshing qualities of your book, Care of the Soul, which I read in preparation. I read it at a point where I suppose I was in a very dry state of mind and soul and spirit. And so this book came and just nourished me with this whole idea that, well, it's actually okay to recognize stories. You don't have to dissociate from everything and just seek total non-attachment. That actually the stories that you don't just fantasize, like an egoic sort of fantasy, but the stories that you receive, that you recognize in your daily life can guide you. In fact, to share a small coincidence, let's say, is that the day when I started reading Care of the Soul, I had a very striking dream, the first in a long time, the first dream I remember, and it had to do with building a house, and the house didn't have foundations, and that was a big problem, and so on. And then I picked up your book, and one of the first things you say is that, one of the most common experiences is people dreaming of building up houses, and this is, signifies the beginning of a new period in life, and so on. And this immediately struck me. And this only drove home the point of how much a more rich life is once we are receptive to stories. This is also your third principle, by the way. Don't take anything literally, but always look deeper. So could you talk a little bit about these, just the stories and the symbolic meaning hidden in everyday experiences?
Well, first, I'd want to say that most spiritual movements have a lot of stories. I mean, Buddhist stories are infinite, it seems. You know, there's so many stories of the Buddha himself. They are so important. The story of the first sermon and the story of the flower, I mean, that is so, so important in the concept of Buddhism, and it's a story. There are many other stories connected to Buddhism. What about the stories in Christianity? The Gospels are all stories. And there's one passage, I've written about this, but there's one short passage in the Gospels, and I've translated the Gospels from Greek. I've published those. There's one short passage where Jesus says, "I speak in parables." And I thought that's such an important statement. It's like him saying, don't misunderstand me. I'm speaking in parables. I'm not speaking in truths and in facts. I'm speaking in parables. These are stories that convey something, and the story doesn't make it limited. It's not, you're not limited to a truth. The story is open to rich interpretation and rich reflection. Look at people who reflected on the Gospels and sermons for 2,000 years. And how many years have they told the stories of the Buddha over and over again? I also use stories of the Sufis, because the Sufis use story, just as they use dance and music, almost as their, well, I think maybe as their main way of presenting what they see are the contradictions in life and the paradoxes that we have to understand. Just like the Tao Te Ching, the Sufis are very, very good on paradox. And it seems to me that if you want to be an advanced spiritual practitioner, you really must understand paradox. You can't have too simple an approach to things, either or. You have to be able to see the paradoxes in life. So stories can do that. They can present these things to us richly with rich possibility. But if someone's giving you a teaching, you've got to watch out for that, because who knows all these things? How can they know them? And how are they certain about them? And they tell other people to follow them and their teachings. I think I trust a storyteller who is a real storyteller like Jesus or the Sufi masters. I really trust them to be sophisticated about storytelling and to have practiced meditation. The Sufis have practiced primarily many of them with dance and with music. And so that's their way to achieve their high level of spiritual attainment. I trust that more than someone sitting meditating by themselves.
And what would you say is the, let's say, most pragmatic, accessible way for people to enrich their lives through stories and recognize stories in their lives in a way that enriches their lives?
Well, it's not all that easy. I mean, you can start by reading. If you want to read or watch movies or good movies, a good movie often has a good story that's rich. A good story is rich. That's not simplistic. It's not moralistic. It's not telling you what to do and how to live. It's not over-explanatory. It doesn't explain, really. It gives you a narrative, a story about characters that are complex, and you have to think a lot about the story to appreciate what's going on in it. That's part of it. So you can read more stories, read more fiction, read poetry, to have more of a sense of the metaphorical rather than the literal. Read poetry, really read it. It's very enriching. And if you don't like poetry, learn to like it. You can do that. So there are many forms of reading and listening that would get you started. And then when it comes to looking at your life, one way you can do it, the best way I know is therapy. I think psychotherapy is a wonderful invention. That's why I do it every day, almost every day. I think it's one of the greatest inventions ever. If you have a good therapist who understands the role of narrative, of story in the work, they will help you explore your stories without giving explanations, but helping you explore and investigate the story of your life, all the many stories of your life. That's what therapy is about primarily. So I would say overall that a person interested in getting spirit and soul together has got to appreciate narrative and story instead of explanation.
This is a fascinating insight, and also it reminds me of my experience with therapy. I actually have been extremely lucky with finding a therapist on the first try who has helped me tremendously. One very memorable experience was actually, and by the way, I have to say the actual experience of psychotherapy with her is very, it's almost psychedelic. It's almost, well, you enter a space and it is somehow outside of time and space. And one memorable experience was when I felt myself that I could observe myself and my life story like reading, for example, one of my favorite books by Dostoevsky. I could see the characters, I could see their development, and I could have, exactly that sort of perspective on reader's perspective on my own life. And I have to say that I've also found it just psychotherapy has been a revolution in my life, completely transformed my life. But for a long time, I resisted it. I don't know if this is widespread or is just the culture in Bulgaria, but I felt that if you go to psychotherapy, this means you just cannot take care of your own life and you're basically admitting defeat. And so for a long time, I resisted it. But at one point, my pride, the problems I was facing with different personal life challenges became so great that my pride just wasn't worth it. And so I decided to give it a try. But I keep coming up against this sort of attitude with people in my life. I know at least a few people very close to me who I can see are dealing with very great challenges and don't really have a perspective outside of their own conditioned perspective. And I know how much therapy could benefit them. But again, there's this attitude, leave aside this foolishness. I can take care of my own life. I can just go out for beer and I will just work. So, and I've been wondering what is the best attitude I can have in that situation, because I've tried to promote therapy very enthusiastically and it has the opposite effect. I've tried to be silent, to not comment and not talk about how helpful it is, but it leaves me feeling that I could help by sharing my personal experience and I'm not doing it. So what do you think about these cases?
It's difficult because to do psychotherapy well, it requires a great deal of work on yourself. And that's not the way it is taught. So we have a lot of psychotherapy in this world that is really taught as a way of engineering someone's life, being the expert who tells the person, reflects to them. I mean, most of the therapists I know are trained not to be that simplistic, but I think it happens. A lot of therapists are just advice givers, and that's not worth much. Who are they to know what a person should do? They don't know. What you do is you sit with a person and you explore their life and their dreams, their stories of their past and so on, as stories, not to look for explanations, but as stories. You build up the whole narrative thrust of a person's life, the treasury of their narratives. And that itself is a very valuable thing. And then you can point out insights that you might have in them. For example, what you just said was interesting to me, that you think about your life and you relate it to some character maybe in fiction.
Yeah.
The example I usually give is that sometimes when people are depressed, they tell their story. I might say to them, "You sound like Hamlet." And what that does it expands the character. Jung used the word amplify in English, if that's correct in English. Amplify the dream. So that means you make it bigger. You connect it. You connect your story with a story, one of the classic stories. And that helps you enlarge it. And you have a sense of yourself that is not so personal. It's not so tight within yourself, but you can see, yes, I'm like Hamlet. And you go read Hamlet, and that might help you because you see that this character is having some experiences that are very similar to your own. That itself can lift some of the weight of what you're carrying. And as a therapist, I do that a lot. I try to amplify the stories, the dreams and the stories people are telling me. I'll tell them over and over again. Oh, that's like, it's like the Three Bears and, a fairy tale that I might know. And that itself is useful in opening up the imagination. So, and you can do that in big ways. And when we do it in a big way, we call it archetypal. We mean that we see like, oh, that's like this. Sounds to me like you are possessed by the great mother. Like this mothering in you is so strong. You sound like one of these goddesses who is the great mother. And maybe that's too much to carry. That's too much to bear. It's not human. So there are many things we can do with these stories, but that means you have to know a lot of stories if you're a therapist then. So I always recommend to therapists that they read a lot of fiction and mythology to be able to enrich their imagination so that when they're listening to the narratives of their clients, they can amplify them better. They can make these connections that help you understand better what's going on. Now, that's asking an ordinary person to do that might be too much. It's asking a lot. But you can suggest, watch some really good films, really good films that make you think and that are poetic. There are a lot of them, really. There are quite a lot of them. They're probably not the majority, but there are a lot of them. Or read some good novels, maybe a recent novel or old novel if you haven't read some of the great old stories, or read mythology. It can be, if it's presented well, it can be entertaining. I think reading should be entertaining most of the time. That's what I look for. But at the same time, some depth. So you educate your imagination by filling it with these images and characters and stories. You do that for yourself and you do it for your clients.
Yes, and also I can see this, how perfectly this also applies to people who are not therapists, because reading your work has inspired me in a very unexpected way to actually read more fiction, because in my line of work there is a strong temptation to just read philosophy books and scholarly articles, and you get all the information there and all the knowledge and all the wisdom even. But then just seeing how you use stories to reveal aspects of experience and truths about life, even though I know you don't like the word now, that otherwise just nonfiction and dry scholarship or philosophy work is just the wrong format for relating these kinds of knowledge. And so you've been inspiring to me in that sense. And one of the stories that you delve into care of the soul is the story of Narcissus. And I found that very interesting. I've told you that many viewers on my channel are interested in Buddhism, and the non-self or no self-teaching is very important there. But there is also big discussion about how this doctrine, if one sort of subscribes to it with blindfolds on, can lead to dissociation from oneself and repression and so on. And you speak about narcissism, and again you talk about going into the symptom. And there's a beautiful passage you have that I just wanted to highlight, and I would love for you to comment on it. So for narcissism, You say, the healing of narcissism, the fulfillment of its symptomatic hunger, is achieved by giving the ego what it needs: pleasure in accomplishment, acceptance, and some degree of recognition. Masochistic refusal of the ego's desire is no way to care for the soul. On the contrary, it is an ascetic bargain that buys a false sense of virtue at the cost of the soul's need. Motivated by thoughts of purity and self-control, a person can deny the ego all kinds of comforts, and yet narcissism may abound. An alternative approach is to hear the soul's complaint and give it love and attention where it needs it, even where we are most suspicious. The secret in healing narcissism is not to heal it at all, but to listen to it. So I would love for you to comment on it. Here is just a complete admission from my side that narcissism is something that I find again and again in my personal life, and I can see very much how spiritual pursuit can feed that sense of narcissism and disconnect me from life and from others. And so I find it very interesting, this comment that you made. Could you expand on it?
Let me say, first of all, that you are a young man, and narcissism is appropriate in your life. It's appropriate. It's a good thing. It can be overwhelming, and other people might get uncomfortable if it's too strong, for sure. If it's too strong, it could be that the roots of it are from starving of the self. Starving it. Maybe parents who don't give enough attention to the self and build up the ego of the child and think that's wrong. It's actually good. I think I have a friend in Belgium who teaches praise, especially of young people. I think it's such a wonderful thing to do, to praise young people. We need praise. We need recognition. And the person who's afraid of narcissism might not go in that direction. They may think there's something wrong with that. So I think that we have to, first of all, in order to go with the symptom, we have to appreciate it somewhat. And Narcissus, remember, the story is of a young man. A young man. We call him in our psychology a puer, using the Latin word. A puer, meaning it's a particular kind of psychology a person at any age might have. But it's a youthfulness. And that's what narcissism starts out as. In the story, Narcissus is a young man, and he's haughty, and he's distant and hard. He's Ovid, the one who wrote that story for us, calls him like marble. He's that hard. He's stony, like stone, like rock, and people can't get through to him. And one day he walks through a forest, and he comes across a pond, and he looks in the pond, which is like a reflecting pool. It's a still pond, and it's and he sees his face in the pond. And we're asked to believe in the story that he falls in love with the face that he sees there. He becomes really enamored of it. He sees, what a beautiful face, or what a wonderful person there, that he sees. And then only later he discovers that this is his own reflection. And in that moment he realizes that actually he is lovable, because he loved this face when he saw it. And so he knows in his own experience that this person is actually lovable. And at that moment, he is transformed into a flower in the story. It's a magical kind of story. He's transformed into a flower. So we're meant to understand that he has been softened, given roots, his beauty manifested, his natural self revealed, all of this in the flower. So this is what happens. And that suggests then that the narcissist, person who has the problem with narcissism, may eventually have to discover through his own experience that he is lovable. That's the story. And so I don't see, my attitude is not to be negative about narcissism. it can be hard to take. And when it's pathological, it's really bad, and it hurts the person, it hurts everyone. So you want to do something with it. When it's really bad, you want some therapy. Therapy not as curing it, it's getting rid of it, but therapy as maybe trying to get it where it can be experienced and brought into life where it isn't so harmful. Nurturing it in a way that might be useful to it, but not getting rid of it. Shaping it, giving it something it needs, and making it more in line with the person's own values and not being painful. These are all things that show that it's not in a condition that's very positive right now. So our job is not to get rid of it, but to work it so that it can be more useful to the person. So what you get at the end of that is a kind of narcissism that's quite nice. Maybe I know people who are narcissistic, but it's quite wonderful, really. It's not. I love the way they love themselves. There are other people I hate the way they love themselves, but it varies. So the one person requires some therapy, but not the kind that is harsh and tries to get rid of it.
In this, the way you speak about narcissism now and also in the book, you remind me of a metaphor the Buddha uses. He criticizes those ascetics that constantly punish the body in order to overcome it, something you mentioned that you've also seen firsthand. And he gives a metaphor of a dog tied with a leash to a post. And as the dog runs around the post, pulling on its leash, it just keeps running in circles around it. And in many ways, I see that spiritual practice can become this exact same thing for the self, for the ego. And in every attempt to heroically outgrow or deny or defeat the ego, it just becomes stronger, and its pull becomes more pathological eventually. So one thing that was really interesting to me that you wrote about narcissism is that the big revelation for Narcissus comes when he sees himself in the pond and he sees himself as an object. And so he loves himself, begins to love himself as an object. And this struck me a lot. And I wonder whether now you can elaborate on what you wrote these 30 odd years ago and what you meant by this. What does it mean to see yourself and love yourself as an object?
Well, I don't mean what people might think when they hear that word. I'm treated as an object. That means you're depersonalized or dehumanized. No, not that at all. You can be an object in a way that's very human, very humane. It's just that you look at yourself less identified with yourself as something outside yourself. It's like in the story, he finds the resolution to his problem outside himself. And yet he's looking at himself. He's looking at this reflection in the water. And he doesn't even know it's him at first. So he's seeing himself more objectively and with some distance. And I think that's a very, very good thing to do. It's essential, really, not to be so personal about everything. When I was a young man, I was in a boating accident when I was 4 years old, and my grandfather saved me and died in the process. And that has had a big effect on me, and I can't really enjoy swimming. I always think I'm drowning. I'm always back in that. Really, it's almost like a return of that moment when I'm in water. I love an aspect of being in the water, but I see it as a real complex of mine. It's something that is. So what I can do is objectify it rather than identify with it so much. And I can say to myself, oh, wow, here I am trying to swim. And this fear is coming back to me. My complex is coming back to me. I want to say, what can I do for this complex right now? Is there something I could do that might help the situation? So I'm not saying oh, poor me, I've been in this, I had this accident, now I can't swim, and all personal, and so all about the moment. I can stand back and say, yes, I've had this complex for many years now, and I've tried various ways to deal with it, and I wonder what I can do now. I'm looking at myself more objectively. I'm looking at this thing that invades me when I'm in water. It comes from nowhere. It's not mine. I haven't created it. It comes out of me. So I look at it objectively, just as Narcissus looked at himself objectively, at distance from himself. And that, I think, is very useful no matter what we do. So as a therapist, I don't talk to people so personally. I do in some ways. I make a good connection with people, but I really try to see them, to understand that they have elements in them that are not there. It's not them really. They're like invaders, or they're like presences that are not them, but are present to them, and they can deal with them. And let's both of us talk about them as though they were real things, not the person.
This is becoming only more fascinating to me, what you're talking about, because there is again this paradox between falling in love with oneself, or let's say learning to love oneself, but doing so non-personally. And if I just want to dig a bit deeper into this, because I see here a convergence between soul work and also spiritual practice. Because, for example, in mindfulness meditation, one begins to observe everything that goes through consciousness. So, for example, as I'm speaking with you now, I can be non-mindful, and I can have some anxiety about the next question, how you're feeling, how I'm feeling, some sort of nervousness and so on. And I identify with these things. Let's say, I am nervous, I am curious, I'm happy, or I'm sad. But once I become mindful, I see these as objects, occurrences within this complex of body and mind. And in this sense, this is how I understand seeing oneself as an object, sort of not claiming ownership on what arises in the body-mind, but this sort of detachment, let's say, also, the way you speak about it, becomes combined with a feeling of great love, non-personal love. So do you see this spirit? Do you think this very spiritual practice and perspective aligns with what you're talking about?
Oh, I certainly do. Yes, I certainly do. You can. I think that first of all, I think that having a kind of meditation where you explore the elements within you now, what is dominant in you at this time of your life, that can be extremely useful in a kind of objectifying way. Not totally depersonalized, but still objective in the way you approach it. I think you understand what I'm saying there. And that kind of practice can be helpful. You have to watch out for some things. You don't want to judge yourself in all of this. Judging yourself is useless. It doesn't really help matters at all. But if you can keep these things objective, you might not be prone to judging yourself so much. But just noticing that these things are in you, and maybe some of these things you don't like, and maybe other people don't like, but they're still there, and you can relate to them.
Yes, and sorry to interrupt you, but then in this example that you're giving, judging oneself can also then become an object one observes within the stream of consciousness.
Yes, you can do that. It's the personalizing that causes most of the trouble, and that really is a kind of narcissism that maybe needs to be sorted through so that it doesn't interfere in that way. I think I don't know if I should say this, but I think most spiritual practitioners probably have a lot of narcissism in their practice. Just wanting to improve yourself, to get better at your meditating, to be more capable of some of the challenges that your teacher tells you about. That itself is a kind of narcissism. I don't think it's a bad thing, but the thing about these things like narcissism and these difficulties that we run into is that they are on the edge of becoming neurotic. They are on the edge of going too far. They're always on the edge. And when you have a spiritual practice, you are putting yourself in a situation in danger of having your soul react pretty strongly because you might neglect it, because you're focusing so much on the spirit. So that means, you see what I'm saying? If you neglect the soul, that's going to complain. And those complaints might infiltrate your spiritual practice. Like narcissism, that might be just part of your life and yourself, and it's working out okay. It's not interfering with your relationships and so on. But if you're in a spiritual practice where you might be trying to get away from the soul or trying to distance it might complain. I think it does complain when it is ignored. And that then might come into your practice. That's where you might find it.
Okay, so I think you're very right, or at least I agree with you strongly that the spiritual practice can be a great vehicle for this guy's narcissism. I mean, I've seen it and I've experienced it as well. I can also see how this once you realize that, it can push you to the other extreme where you say, oh, I'm just giving up with all this sort of practice and I'm just giving up with all efforts to improve myself and so on. But this isn't really a step forward. It's just lashing to the other side. So what would you advise people to do once they see that they just have this pattern of their experience and their behavior that comes again and again?
When I was a monk, we had a practice of, I forget what it was called, maybe just examination of conscience. I don't know, but it was a kind of meditating that was to focus in particular on kind of negative things that are going on inside you or in your life or in your relationships, to explore those, to examine them and see if there are some things going on that you can see that maybe you could address in your life so that they wouldn't be there. And I think that a person doing a spiritual practice could also at the same time should have a soul practice. I mean, they go together. They should be both taking place at the same time. One of those soul practices might be to either to look at yourself. It's not easy, but to look at yourself and see, maybe look at yourself more psychologically at the soul level. What's going on? What are your relationships doing? What about the emotions you're experiencing as you're doing your practice? What kind of negative things might be coming through, like an extreme narcissism in your practice, or perfectionism, or other things that might weaken you as a person? So that might help. And if that doesn't help, maybe what you could do is either find a person, a friend, a spiritual friend, what they call anamkara in Ireland, a spiritual friend who guides you, helps you. If you find a friend who you can talk about things with like that, that'd be great. If you can't, maybe get a group together where as a group you can say, in my spiritual practice, I like to describe some of the things that I find are not helping me or that as a person are interfering in some way. And at a deeper level, I want to explore my spiritual practice more deeply and not just always focus on getting better, but focus on those things that might be happening that are largely unconscious, but I can sense that they're going on, that my friends are telling me that they're complaining about who I am now. And I want to know what's happening to me because of my spiritual practice. I think that kind of thing would be very useful.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the usefulness of having some sort of community, and this is actually one of the principles you mentioned, finding somebody who can provide you with a different perspective other than your own. Yeah.
That's right. I think it's very valuable, very important. But I don't see that happening in spiritual communities much at all. I think the emphasis is much more on the individual attaining some high level of something or other. And I think it would be very good not just to have community, but that community has to be there to be able to help a person see who they are at this deeper level or at this more ordinary level at the same time, so that it isn't all just about getting higher and higher.
I can see that we're almost past the hour-and-a-half mark. But before we finish, I don't want to use too much of your time, but I wanted to touch on, again, something very important, I think, in your work, which is that you talk about sex and sexuality and how this can be integrated into a spiritual, soulful life. I think this is, again, one of the things that it can very easily be stigmatized in spiritual sort of circles. You have different vows of celibacy, you have different attacks on sensuality and on sexuality and so on. And again, in my personal life, I've seen how important it is to make some sense and build a relationship with my sexuality. And I've also seen the dangers that come once you begin to wage war with it. And so I wanted to hear how your understanding of sexuality has evolved and how you can see it being integrated in a healthy way in a wholesome life.
Well, I go back to psychological polytheism. For the Greeks, they had a god of purity, Artemis, who didn't want to have anything to do with sex or with people. Really, she stayed in the forest, and she's very tall. She represents that height, that personal height that people want to achieve in their spiritual work. But there was another goddess, Aphrodite, who all she wanted was sex. She just wanted to. She was the goddess of having a very rich sex life, and it's so now the two of them, according to in mythology, they have a hard time reconciling their two positions, but they acknowledge them. There's one play in which Aphrodite says to Artemis, "I know that you don't like what I do, what I'm involved in here, but we're sisters, and we have to understand each other. And whatever you want from this mortal human being that you are connected to right now is fine with me. The problem is if he neglects me, he's really going to be in trouble." So that's, to me, that is a citation in Greek drama that is essential to this question. That they are sisters, being pure and removed from sex, being celibate in some way, and being highly sexual and sensual in your life. That also is an equally valid way of being spiritual. This doesn't, you don't take the goddess there as being, she's not mortal. She's a goddess. This is a spiritual way to be. And some people have discovered that their sexuality becomes their spiritual path. And for a lot of people, though, it's negative. It's something that interferes, and it's something moralistically to be condemned or avoided or limited, at least in some way. I think it's much better to be polytheistic about that and say, well, I want to be a very highly spiritual person. I want to go as far as I can in my spiritual practice. But I don't have to give up my sexuality. In fact, the more sexual I become at the same time, probably the better everything is.
Yes, this is something I've discovered as well. And I can see this split in our world, because pornography is becoming a greater and greater part of just mainstream culture, and on the other side, this sort of war on sexuality and on sensuality is continuing in many religious and spiritual traditions. I myself, unfortunately, have been now I see it this way, the victim of being exposed to pornography very early in life. And so it has come with tremendous consequences. And also I've seen this side of it in spiritual circles, where sexuality is something to be transcended completely. And so how do you see a healthy approach to sexuality for either one who is sort of sucked in by pornography culture, or by sort of the war on sensuality in spiritual circles?
One way would be, and this is a little difficult to express, but would be not to be too negative about pornography. Hillman gave a lecture once. In fact, he and I were both lecturing at a church, and I gave a lecture on the Marquis de Sade, which is quite pornographic, but he gave a lecture on pornography itself. And what we're doing, I think we both understood each other pretty well. And what we want to say is that pornography can be very extreme and have negative impact on people. But on the other hand, we know from dreams that dreams are very erotic, often very erotic and very sensual and almost pornographic, but I don't want to use that word for the dream, but I would say erotic. And it leads me to, I guess my own approach has been, both personally and professionally, has been to favor erotic imagery. That I think that the religions that provided us, both in the East and certainly in the West, with great religious pornography, not pornography, but erotic imagery.
Yeah.
And people might dismiss that or might confuse it with pornography, but it isn't. It's understanding the power of eros, the power of pleasure, the power of the body, the power of the body's potential and power to give us pleasure and interest. We might be very interested in what we see in pornography. So the pornography might be the extreme, but the erotic imagery is something that is fruitful and useful. I would recommend that people actually bring more erotic imagery into their lives and have it around and appreciate, enjoy it. My wife's a painter, and she paints a lot of nudes, nude bodies, but in the context, they're not pornography at all. We have had, when our kids were small, some of the parents asked them, didn't want to bring the kids to our house because of her paintings. They're not extreme whatsoever. Believe me, I would hardly even call them pornographic, but at all, I wouldn't call them that at all. They're erotic. So I think that distinction might help us. And I think if you could become comfortable with erotic imagery, you might be able to diminish some of your deep revulsion about pornography. You don't want it because it's not what you're looking for, and it's an aberration. But you are not being moralistic and hiding it. What you're doing is finding it. You're finding erotic imagery and seeing how valuable that can be. And then pornography is just the wrong approach. It's not some evil from hell. It's something where it's just being done in a way that's excessive. And it seems to be excessive because we are so puritanical in our approach to eroticism.
Yeah, thank you. I've found that much of what you're saying is true. Finding a way to celebrate the erotic, bring it into the intimate relationship, yes, finding a way to appreciate its surface, but also seeing that there's more to it than its surface. That it is actually a deep expression and dimension of experience of life. The last thing I want to ask you, you've written a book about it, and you also mention it you also speak about it in Care of the Soul, and this is depression or dark night of the soul or spiritual crisis and so on. So recently, I've had an experience like that, which was very difficult, quite hopeless in the beginning, but then by the end, I've been extremely grateful for it and for the way it has set my priorities straight and made me reconsider many important aspects of my life. And I know that many of our listeners will have gone through periods like that, but also many of them will be in such periods at the moment. So for somebody who is struggling with an extremely difficult period in their life, a loss of meaning, purpose, interest, inspiration, and motivation, what guidance would you give them?
There's so many forms of depression. It's hard to speak to it in a broad way. There are many different ways it might manifest. I'll tell you, right now, my daughter is very ill, and she's in her early 30s, and very, beyond belief, creative person, and has so much to do and give. It's very, very difficult. I feel that kind of depression that's always there. It's something for me in relation to that. So I know I just want to say that I know a certain kind of depression. And I think that what we can do most of the time, not always, but most of the time, we can see that depression is one of the moods that is human, that comes through our life. And it may come at different times. It's never happy. That's the very meaning of it. It's not happy. It tends to linger long than you want it to. And it's also resistant to efforts to get rid of it or to change it. Even for the therapist, to me, it's one of the most difficult things to deal with. It's very difficult. But I think you start out by seeing that it's something that's natural, that depression is one of our moods. It'd be almost as if someone came to you as a therapist and said, I'm really disturbed because I'm so happy. I just can't handle it. It's one of those moods. It comes and goes. Happiness doesn't last forever. Depression usually doesn't last forever. For some people, it seems to, and it does last quite a while. But I think that's the first thing, to take it as natural and normal, and maybe use different language for it. Depression makes it sound clinical. And I do find that the antidepressive drugs do help people a little bit. They help them be able to live through their depression if it's a very deep depression. I've never spoken against antidepressive drugs because I see that they can help at a certain level. But I think they have to be accompanied by a deep soul therapy. And that's what I try to do. So depression is something that's going to happen to us. And when it comes, though it doesn't feel good, that's the nature of the thing. But as you were implying, and what Hillman says, is that depression allows us to see the world in a way we can't see it otherwise. And it gives us maybe some insights into what's happening. So I found myself as a therapist that it's not a good idea to work against your depression, to fight it. It doesn't help too much. As a therapist, it doesn't help me to try to tell people, oh, this is really a bad scene. This is really hard. You're going to get through it. but to rather to be not to be too light about it at all, but to, as I've been saying, to try to see it as a natural process and offer that hope for it, if there's any hope. And the other thing that I've recommended in Dark Nights of the Soul is to find different ways in your world to have, this is approach to therapy in general, to find things in the world that will correspond to your depression. For example, go to a depressive play or to a depressive movie. Get into it, see what it's about, feel it at different levels, different ways. When you avoid it, it seems to get worse. When you try to do things to avoid it, try to go to a party or lift your spirits, I'm not sure that's the best way. The tradition, it's a very, very old tradition, hundreds of years old at least, says that the best way to deal with depression is to find depressive elements in your life. One place I read, a simple suggestion was to go out into the world and stay in the shade. Don't go into the sunshine. Or wear a hat that's very big, has a big broad brim, so it keeps you shaded. Identify with the depression more. Not identify so much, but have it there. Cultivate it. Cultivate the mood that's there. And
actually, I just wanted to say that sad music, beautiful sad music, has been my greatest support and therapist through difficult periods in my life. I see how very beautiful sad music just helps you go deeper, but in a way that really makes space and respects what you're going through and shows the beauty and the splendor of extremely difficult feelings and experiences. So this has been of great support to me.
One of the persons that I have studied, I won't go into the whole story of it, but when I studied a Renaissance philosopher, Marsilio Ficino, and he was really a good therapist, and he wrote a lot about depression. And when his friends were depressed, he would have them come to his home, and he would play sad music to them. He played a string instrument of some kind, and he'd play a very sad music on it. He said, "Come to me, and I will play you some depressive music." And but he did suggest in his writing, he said something that I keep in mind. And he's speaking now. He spoke astrologically about the planets. That was his main language. And he said that when you are depressed, have some solar and Venusian things around you, the sun and Venus, Aphrodite, and the sun. So have bright things, have some sunshine in your life a little bit, and have a little bit of Venusian pleasure, sensual pleasure, that sort of thing. But he says those are only to be used a little bit, not too much, because they won't take it away. But they will help you get through it, give you some relief. But he said the main thing is to go to Saturn, who is the god of depression, the planet of depression, and do things that are depressive, do things that are darker and sadder. You don't have to overwhelm yourself with that, but just like you were saying, listen to some music that is sadder, that you find sad, and allow yourself to experience that sadness in a way that is pleasurable in some ways, that is not the enemy.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas, for being here, for everything you've shared, and also for the amazing body of work you've produced and you've shared. Care of the Soul has enriched me tremendously. Sadly, in the short time I had to prepare for our conversation, that was the only book of yours I had the chance to read, but it has only inspired me to dive into other works of yours as well. I would also love to encourage our audience to explore your work, because there's a new paradigm, a new perspective that your work brings, that your work has brought me, and I feel it has the potential to greatly enrich many people. So where would you invite anybody interested to get into your work? What would you encourage them to pick up first, and where can they find it?
Well, the basic book for me is Care of the Soul, for sure. That's where the basics are, the fundamentals. But I don't know. Just pick up a book if you find it. They're around. Some are in translation, some are not, if that's an issue. And just go into that place. I can't really select any one. One of my favorites, I have to say, is one that my wife and I collaborated on, and it's called Original Self, which might be of some interest to Buddhists. I don't know. Maybe it should be Original Non-Self, but it's a book of very short pieces and some woodcuts that my wife made. She's a really fine artist. So that to me, that's little pieces to read, like one page at a time. And I think that's a beautiful book, and I recommend that. I'd also recommend, if people want to go further in this, I teach a weekly course in all this work. I call it now, I changed the name of it recently. I used to call it soul psychology, but now I call it imaginal psychology. And you can find out about that on my website, thomasmoresoul.com. Thomas More Soul. Use the word soul. There's a lot of Thomas Moores around. thomasmoresoul.com. And I have a section there called courses, and it's all explained. And other things, other books, other things there. So I think that's all the resources I can think of at the moment.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Again, it's been a tremendous pleasure and enrichment for me. And I also hope for one day again speaking with you and delving into other aspects of your work. I thank you very much for being part of this podcast.
Well, I enjoyed it too, because I like this fact that we can take some time and really explore things. You were very good at that, to letting me speak so much. And your interest and your knowledge, that helps a great deal. And I do hope that I love very much what you say. It's music to my ears to hear you say that it's a new paradigm that might be useful to people. It's all I ask for, something like that. That would be fantastic. Especially to spiritual practitioners who I didn't get a chance to say how much I appreciate what they do and what they're doing. And I'm only offering a way that I think might make it richer and more valuable. After all, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, this is the effect it has had on me. So I think it would be of great value to many people. Thank you.